So here's a short video on understanding simple indices. So if we look at the expression a times a, we can write that in mathematics in a shorter way. And we write that as being equal as a to the power 2. And this is this 2 that is called the indice. So a times a is a to the power 2. So a times a has a multiplying itself once, twice, 3 times, so we've got 3 a's, and so the indice now will be 3. So we have a cubed. If we change the letter, so let's change that letter to x, we've got x times x times x times x, then we have 4 x's that are multiplying each other, so it's x raised to the indice or power. The word indice and power are the same in maths, and so that would be to the power 4. So in this next example, you can see we've got d times d times d times d times d. So count your number of d's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you'll see that it is d raised to the indice or power 5. Now what if you had d squared times d cubed? Well, to understand this, we will write this out the other way around. So we'll say that d squared is d times d, and we'll say that d cubed is d times d times d. So just so you can understand that, so our d squared is d times d, and our d cubed is d times d times d. Now, if you look at the top example, we can see that we've got the same thing. So what we looked at here, we now have here. So our answer is d to the power 5. D to the power 5, as it's d times itself. There's 5 lots of d's in the multiplication. Now, could we have seen a connection which makes this problem easier when we look at the indices? So we've got 2 and 3, and our answer was 5. So you might realise that we could have done this simply by adding together the indices 2 and 3, and that would give us the answer d to the power 5. So now we'll look at division. So we want to simplify the expression d to the power 5 divided by d to the power 3. So I'm going to write them out long to start with. So we know that d to the power 5 is d times d times d times d times d. And on our bottom we've got d to the power 3, so more like a d times d times d. And so now we can look at what cancels out. Now if we multiply and divide by the same number, it's a bit like saying 5 divided by 5, and it cancels itself down to 1. So I can cancel off all the d's on the top with the d's on the bottom. And that will leave me with d times d times d, which is d squared. So that's our answer. Our answer is d squared. But once again, we can see a connection here. Had we done a subtraction, if we're doing d to the power 5 divided by d to the 3, then we can subtract those powers or indices. So d to the 5 minus 2, minus 3, should I say. So cut that out. D to the power 5 minus 3 will give us d squared. We'll just do a few mixed examples to finish. So perhaps you might like to try these first and then see whether you've got them right. So here are the answers. D to the power 4 times d to the power 3. And we need to add the indices together, so it's d to the power 7. The next question, d to the power 6 divided by, as it's division, so we must remember to subtract those indices. So we have d to the 6 minus 2, which equals d to the power 4. We have another division question, d to the power 4 divided by d cubed. So that's d. Now you don't have to write the subtraction out, but I'm doing it so you can see what's going on. And that's d to the power 1, and we can write that simply as d. Finally, another multiplication, d to the 7 times d cubed equals d to the 7 plus 3, which equals d to the 10. So there are your 4 answers, d to the 7, d to the 4, d, and d to the 10. So I hope this has helped you understand simple indices.